The snow came sideways off the ridge that night, the kind that doesn't fall so much as hunt, and I had been walking for 4 hours in boots that had stopped being waterproof somewhere around October. It was November 14th, a Thursday. I knew that because I'd been counting days the way you do when you don't have anywhere to be, and the counting is the only thing that makes the hours feel real. 41 days since I'd left Harlem. 41 days since I'd packed everything I owned into a canvas army surplus bag that had belonged to my grandfather, walked to the end of Crawford Street, and turned north on the 2-lane toward the Daniel Boone National Forest without quite knowing why north felt more honest than any other direction. I was 18 years old, my name was Bryony Holcomb, and I weighed maybe 120 pounds with the pack on. I had $63 folded in a sandwich bag against my ribs, a buck 110 folding knife my grandfather had pressed into my palm the summer before he died, half a box of saltine crackers, and the particular kind of stubbornness that gets young women killed in mountains every single winter. The ridge I was crossing was somewhere above 4,000 feet in the eastern edge of Leslie County, Kentucky, a fold of the Cumberlands that doesn't show up in any guide because nobody goes there on purpose. The locals called it Painter Knob, though the name wasn't on any map I'd ever seen. Painter being the old Appalachian word for panther, the big cats that were supposed to have worked these hollows back before the tipple companies cleared everything worth clearing. Whatever they'd hunted here was long gone. What was left was second-growth oak and poplar, a lot of laurel thicket, and a wind that felt personal. My mother had been dead 160 days. The cancer had taken her in the spring, slow and patient, the way cancer takes mothers when it wants to make sure their daughters remember every detail of the leaving. Elspeth Holcomb, 36 years old, hospice nurse before she got sick, the kind of woman who could fold a fitted sheet without anybody teaching her, and who hummed church hymns under her breath, even when she didn't believe in the words anymore. She had been 36 years old. 36. I want to write that twice because I have not yet found a way to say it once that does not feel like a swallowed stone. 36 is a young age for a woman to die. It is a young age for a girl to lose her mother. It is a young age to leave a daughter alone in a house with the man you had married because you had been too tired and too sick to fight him off when he came up the porch steps 2 years before with flowers and a steady job at the loading dock. My stepfather, Roy Tillman, had moved into the house 6 weeks after the funeral. He had not been kind before. He had not been kind during. He was less kind after, in the particular way men get less kind when they understand that no one is going to stop them. I had left on the night he came home from the burger box drunk and put his hand around the back of my neck and called me by my mother's name. I had walked out the back door with a plastic bag of clothes and slept that first night in a culvert behind the Dollar General, the Army surplus pack and the knife I had retrieved from my grandfather's storage shed the next morning before the sun came up, because Roy did not know that shed existed, and because my grandfather had left those things to me specifically, and I was not going to give Roy the chance to sell them. That had been 41 days ago. I had walked north because north was where my grandfather used to talk about going. He had been a forester for the state until his lungs gave out, and he had told me once, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee and a cigarette he wasn't supposed to be smoking, that there were places up in the Cumberlands where a person could disappear if a person needed disappearing. I had needed disappearing. The 41 days had not been one shape but many. They had been the shape of an interstate culvert and the shape of an open box car in a switching yard outside of London, Kentucky. They had been the shape of 3 nights spent inside the loading dock of a hardware store in Hazard before the manager noticed me at 5 a.m. and instead of calling the sheriff, fed me a bowl of grits from his own breakfast and told me to keep walking and not come back. They had been the shape of 2 days unloading trucks at that same hardware store in exchange for a hot meal and a bag of supplies. They had been the shape of a Saturday afternoon at a gas station up at Farwell, where a tall, thin man at the counter had cashed a torn $12 money order for me without asking my name twice, and had asked instead what I was walking toward, and had not pressed when I could not answer him. The 41 days had been the shape of every place a girl on foot in Kentucky in October and November, confined to lay her body down for 6 hours. They had been the shape of nothing. I had dropped below the tree line when my left boot went through the ice on a creek crossing I hadn't seen in the dark. The water hit my foot like a closed fist. Cold like that isn't a temperature. It's a decision the mountain is making about you. I said something out loud that my mother would not have approved of, scrambled up the opposite bank, and stood there in the dark, listening to my own breathing and trying to calculate how long I had before the cold moved up my leg and started making decisions about the rest of me. That's when I saw it. 40 yards up the hollow, half buried in hemlock shadow, a shape that didn't belong to the forest. A straight line, walls meeting at a right angle, man-made geometry in the middle of something that had been trying very hard to forget men existed. I stood still for a long moment, the wind cutting my left foot, going from pain to the quieter and more dangerous state of not feeling much at all. Then I started moving toward it, because the mountain had just offered me something, and whatever else I'd learned, in 18 years I had learned that when the mountain offers you something in the dark, you don't stop to ask questions. The cabin was smaller than it had looked from across the hollow, maybe 14 feet by 16. I'd find that out later by pacing it after my hands worked again. The walls were hewn log notch and fitted at the corners without nails the way people built things when nails cost money and time didn't. The roof had a pitch to it, and even in the dark, I could see the tin sheeting. The one section near the east eave had peeled back like a lid and was letting the sky in. The door was a plank door, 2-inch hemlock hung on iron pintles, no padlock, a wooden latch on the outside, the kind you lift with a finger. I stood in front of it for a moment with my wet boot and my failing foot and the wind coming up the hollow at my back, and I thought about what might be living inside something that hadn't been opened in God knows how long. Bear den, porcupine, rot that had eaten the floor through and would drop me to the ground the second I stepped in. Then my foot stopped feeling the cold entirely, and I lifted the latch. The smell that came out was not rot. It was old wood and wood smoke, so deep in the grain it had become part of the grain, and something faintly animal, a mouse nest somewhere probably, and underneath all of that, something almost sweet, like dried herbs, like lavender, that had been hung from a beam and forgotten and lost most but not all of its perfume. The smell of a place that had been lived in hard and then left with some care by someone who had cared. I got my flashlight out of my jacket pocket, a Streamlight Pro tack I'd carried for 2 years, one of the few things I'd thought to bring. The beam swept the interior, and I stood in the doorway, taking inventory the way a person in trouble takes inventory, which is floor first, then ceiling, then the most important corners. The floor was intact, rough sawn boards gray with age but solid when I put my weight on the threshold. The ceiling, the underside of the rafters, was low enough that a tall man would need to mind his head. I would not, being 5'4" in my socks. And in the far left corner, which was the most important corner, there was a stove, a small barrel stove, cast iron, sitting on a square of fire brick. The pipe rose straight up and passed through a sheet metal collar in the ceiling. I crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched down and opened the firebox door and put my flashlight inside it. Clean. Someone had cleaned it out before they left. There was no ash, just a faint ghost of rust on the iron and a small curl of birch bark sitting on the grate, like it had been placed there deliberately, like a note. I sat down on the floor with my back against the stove's cold flank and started pulling off my boot, because the first problem was my foot, and there would be time for every other question after that. The boot came off hard. My fingers were clumsy from the cold, and the laces had frozen stiff at the hooks, so I worked them loose one by one, slow, like I was diffusing something. When the boot finally came free, I set it beside me and pulled off the wool sock underneath, and then I just looked at the foot for a moment without touching it. The two smallest toes on my left side had gone the color of a bruised plum, not white. I knew white was worse, but deep purple at the tips, fading back through red towards something that looked almost normal near the arch. I pressed a fingertip against the smallest toe. There was sensation, dull, distant, like pressing through a leather glove, but it was there. I breathed out through my nose and held the foot in both hands and tucked it up against the inside of my thigh and just sat that way back against the cold iron of the barrel stove while the feeling began to come back in slow waves that were equal parts relief and misery. My mother had been a nurse. She had taught me years ago, when I was maybe 9, that frostbite was a thing you could survive if you understood that warming had to be slow and steady, and that the pain coming back was the body telling you it was still on your side. Hot water was wrong. Fire was wrong. A thigh was right. The body's own heat was the safest heat there was. I sat there in the dark with my mother's voice in my head, holding my own foot like it was someone else's. And for the first time in 41 days, I did not feel like I was alone. Outside, the wind had picked up. I could hear it finding gaps in the cabin, a thin whistle at the north-facing window, a low moan somewhere in the eave above me. The flashlight was propped against my knee, throwing a circle of yellow light up the near wall, and that was the first time I really looked at that wall. There was a shelf above the single window, 2 canned goods on it, labels too faded to read in that light. Beside the cans, a tin cup with the handle broken off the break, old and clean, and leaning against the wall below the shelf, something I hadn't registered in those first cold minutes of arrival, a splitting axe with a handle that had been refitted, the head wrapped in a band of copper wire to keep the steel from walking up the wood. Someone had worked to keep that axe. Someone had cared about it enough to wire it and set it back in the corner where it could be found. I pressed harder against my toes. The pain sharpened, which was good. Sharp pain was live tissue. The curl of birch bark on the grate was where my mind kept returning. It was too deliberate. Whoever had cleaned that stove, cleaned it down to bare iron, had left exactly one thing inside it, not by accident. You don't accidentally place birch bark on a grate. You place it there because birch bark catches from a single match even when it's been dry for a decade, and you place it there because you expect someone to come after you in the cold, and you want that person to have fire within 60 seconds of deciding they needed it. Someone had thought about me, not me specifically, but whoever I was, whoever would come next. I looked toward my pack by the door where I'd lashed a small bundle of fatwood to the outside frame, and then I looked back at that axe, and then I let my eyes drift behind the door. And that was the second thing I saw that did not belong to a man's hand. A cotton apron, faded blue, hung from a hook of bent nail at shoulder height, brown at the edges from years. The ties carefully folded around the neck loop like someone had taken it off and put it away properly the last time it was worn. Not a thing tossed there, a thing arranged. I looked at it for a long time. In my experience, men do not hang aprons that way. Men do not hang aprons at all mostly. And the men who do not fold the ties. I shifted my flashlight up to the shelf above the window, the tin cup, the cans, and something I hadn't seen on the first pass because it was behind the cup, an ivory comb, or bone more likely given the era. The kind of comb a woman keeps for 50 years because her own mother gave it to her, and there's a tooth missing at the side and a hairline cracked down the spine, and you do not throw away a thing your mother gave you, no matter how cracked it gets. I sat back against the stove and let that information settle. A woman had lived here, or a woman had been here last, long enough to hang an apron the right way and leave a comb on the shelf and place birch bark on the grate for whoever came after. I do not know why that changed something in me, but it did. I let go of my foot. The toes were pink now, the purple receding. The pain was the steady, hot, manageable kind. I pulled the wool sock back over the foot and laced the boot back on loose. Then I stood up, carefully on the wet floor, my balance still off from the cold, and I crossed the 3 steps back to my pack and dragged it inside and shut the door behind me and dropped the inside latch into place. The wind went on outside. The cabin went still. I lit the fire. I crouched in front of the open firebox and looked at that birch bark for a moment longer. Then I reached into my shirt pocket and pulled out a book of matches. A Bic lighter I had too, but matches first, and I thought about the person who had swept this floor. The match lit on the first strike. I held it to the corner of the birch bark and watched the flame find the oil in the paper-thin outer layer the way it always does. A brief hesitation, then a decision. The bark curled and caught. Below it, whoever had laid this fire had placed cedar shavings over a bed of dry grass, and below that 2 split pieces of softwood no thicker than my wrist, and below those a single piece of hardwood, dense and dark, probably oak, split clean and aged to the color of old leather. It was a teaching fire. Someone had built it the way you build a fire when you want the person who finds it to understand something. I sat back on my heels and watched it grow. The stovepipe ticked as the metal expanded. A smell came off the first burning. Dust, old creosote from the pipe walls, something faintly animal, maybe a mouse nest, dislodged somewhere up in the flue, and then it cleared, and what came through was just wood smoke. Clean, and particular the way wood smoke is when the tree it came from grew in cold ground. By the time the hardwood caught, maybe 8 minutes after I struck the match, I could feel the radiant heat on my hands from 3 feet away. The single pane window to my left was already beginning to fog at the corners. I sat there on the floor a long time before I let myself feel anything about being warm. When I did, it came in a wave I was not prepared for. I had not cried in 41 days, not when I left the house, not when I walked past the church my mother had been buried out of and kept walking, not on the 8 nights I had slept under bridges and the 4 nights I had slept inside the loading dock of a hardware store in Hazard before the manager noticed. Not at all. I cried then, quietly, my forehead pressed against my knees, the fire ticking in front of me, the apron hanging behind me in the dark. I cried for maybe 2 minutes, and then I stopped because crying was a thing you could do once and then had to get back from, and I had work to do. I stood up. I peeled off my coat and hung it on the hook beside the apron. I peeled off my outer flannel and hung it from the back of the single wooden chair. I refilled the firebox with 2 more pieces of split oak from a small stack beside the stove that I had not registered before, and then I turned slowly in the middle of that room, and I looked at it properly for the first time. The space was perhaps 12 feet by 14, low ceiling, the walls bare log with chinking in the gaps. A shelf ran the length of the north wall, bolted directly into the logs, with iron brackets that had been hand-forged, not cast. You can tell by the slight irregularity in the taper. On the shelf, 3 glass jars with lids, contents unclear in the low light, a tin coffee can, a folded piece of cloth, and at the far left end of the shelf, leaning against the log wall, at a slight angle, a notebook, not a spiral notebook, not a composition book, something older, a hardbound ledger of some kind, maybe 6 inches by 9, the cover a dark brown that might once have been black, the spine cracked, a strip of leather had been wound around it twice and tied in a half hitch to keep it closed. I did not move toward it yet. There's a thing the cold does to your judgment when you've been outside long enough. It makes you impatient, makes you want to grab and open and use. I had learned to wait out that impulse. The fire needed tending first. The door needed to be checked. My wet gloves needed to come off and be hung somewhere they could dry. I pulled the single wooden chair to within 2 feet of the stove and sat down. The stove ticked as it expanded. I peeled off my left glove first. The wool had frozen slightly at the cuff, and the fabric came away stiff, trailing a small puff of frost. Then the right. My fingers were the color of raw meat, and the feeling coming back into them was that particular burning that isn't warmth, yet just the body arguing with itself. I draped both gloves over the back of the chair, close enough to the stove to dry, but not close enough to scorch. I had learned that distinction the hard way back in October. A glove with a scorched palm is worse than a wet one. The fire was drawing well now. I could hear it not crackling the way a fire sounds in movies, but a low, steady pull, almost like breathing. The stovepipe had been fitted tight, and the damper was positioned right. Whoever built this chimney knew what they were doing. You can tell a careful person by their chimney the way you can tell a careful person by their stitching. I sat with my hands open toward the heat and let my eyes adjust to the room. There was a single window on the south wall, maybe 12 inches by 18, covered with what had been oilcloth once. It had gone brittle and translucent, letting in a gray, toneless light that did nothing to warm the room visually. A bunk was fixed to the east wall, single wide, rope sprung, the rope sagging but unbroken, a thin mattress of ticking stuffed with something that had compressed to maybe 2 inches, a folded blanket on top, dark gray wool, moth-eaten along one edge. Someone had lived here, not visited, lived. There's a difference you feel in a room before you understand it. Visited spaces have a certain emptiness that's passive. Lived spaces push back. This one pushed back, and it pushed back in a way I was beginning to recognize. The way certain houses I had been in as a child pushed back. Houses where women had been for a long time, where there had been the daily small work of making a space hold its shape. I had not realized until that moment that rooms had a gender to them. Maybe they don't really. Maybe it was just the apron and the comb. But I would have known anyway. I would have known walking in blindfolded. This was a woman's room. I let that settle. I did not turn to look at the notebook yet. I made myself sit and let the warmth move into my hands and let the room speak first. I noticed a row of pegs on the back of the door, 5 of them, bent nails driven careful and even. 4 were empty. 1 held the apron. Below the pegs on a small shelf of split board sat a chipped enamel basin, white with blue around the rim, the kind of basin a person uses to wash up before bed. I noticed that the floor between the stove and the bunk and the door had 3 worn paths in it. Not 1. 3. Stove to door, stove to bunk, stove to the shelf with the notebook. 3. As if the person who had lived here had 3 errands she did every day for a very long time, and those 3 errands had worn 3 lines into split log punchin' over more years than I could quickly count. I noticed that the chinking in the corners had been redone in places. You could see it. The original chinking was a darker mud. The patches were lighter. There was a patch near the door that was almost fresh, almost still moist looking, though that might have been the cold playing tricks. I went and put my finger against it. It was not fresh, but it was not 40 years old either. I sat back down. The fire was running steady. The stovepipe was no longer ticking. The wind had shifted slightly outside and now came at the cabin from the northwest where I had seen the gap in the chinking earlier. I would need to fix that gap before the night got any deeper, but first I would look at the notebook. I stood up and crossed the 3 steps to the shelf and lifted it carefully with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. The leather was dry under my fingers, almost chalky in the cold. I worked the half-hitch loose slowly, the way you'd do it if the knot mattered, and it did, though I couldn't have told you why yet. The strip came free and I set it on the shelf beside me. The cover was dark brown or had been. Decades of handling had worn it lighter along the spine, and at the corners leaving a ghostly outline of where a hand had gripped it most. A small hand, I could tell from the wear pattern, not a man's grip, a woman's grip. The thumb on the right, the four fingers wrapped at the spine. A woman who had held this book 1,000 times, maybe 10,000 times, until the leather remembered her. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was small and slanted slightly to the right. Pencil, kept very sharp. Not the loose cursive of a woman in a hurry. This was the script of someone who had decided that what she was writing down deserved to be legible to someone other than herself. That choice to write clearly for a future reader told me something before I'd read a single word. October the 4th, 1951. Arrived at the upper cabin by way of Coburn Creek Trail. 11 hours on foot from the Ridgeline Road cutoff. 3 miles of it carrying both packs because the path crosses the slide where I broke my ankle in '46, and I will not lose my footing in that place again. Provisions for 8 weeks. Left the cart at Elmer Bishop's farm in Farwell. He will not ask questions, and he will not speak my name. Vera. I read that last line 3 times. Not. He's a good man. Not. He knows I'll be back. He will not ask questions, and he will not speak my name. Vera. The woman who wrote this had organized her life around the specific value of silence from other people, and had signed only with the first name as if to remind herself the last name was no longer hers to use. I turned the page. October the 5th. Wind from the northwest hard. Temperature dropped 18 degrees between noon and dark. The roof on the lean-to has gone soft along the north ridge. 3 boards need replacing before any real snow. Found the axe where I left it in the spring. Still sharp. The creek is running clear. This is a good place to think. A good place to not be found. I said the last sentence out loud in the dark room, quietly, just to hear how it landed. It landed the same way it had on the page. A good place to not be found. I sat down on the edge of the bunk with the notebook open across my knees, and I read, October the 7th. Repaired the lean-to. Used the boards from behind the smokehouse. The wire I brought up from Bishop's was enough for the chimney collar. I expect it will need redoing in 3 or 4 years, but I will not be the one to redo it. Whoever comes next can do that work, and welcome to it. I lifted my eyes from the page. The chimney collar. I had glanced at it on the way in the dark, and registered only that the tin was pulled away on the uphill side. The pine pitch I had seen patched into it had felt soft when I touched it, but I had attributed that to the cold. I had not registered that pine pitch does not stay soft for 75 years. Pine pitch hardens in a season. The patch I had seen on that chimney collar had been put there recently by someone. I turned back to the notebook. October the 9th. Bishop sent word by way of the boy. He says the law has been to the house twice asking after me. Margaret has told them I went to my sister's in Tennessee. The sister has been instructed and will say the same if asked, which she will not be because the law in Whitley County does not cross into Knox without a reason, and there is no reason. Whitley County, Knox County, 2 counties south. I turned the page. October the 12th. The girls. I cannot write it yet. The girls. The line was set off on the page by itself. The pencil had bitten deeper into the paper on that line than on any other, as if the writer had pressed too hard, as if she had been writing through her own hand. I turned the page slowly. It was blank. The next page was blank too, and the next. 3 blank pages, and then on the 4th in handwriting that was looser, slightly worse, as if written later by a person who had not yet recovered her steadiness. October the 18th. I have decided I will write what I came here to write. There is no use in keeping it inside any longer. There is no one here to hear it but the walls, and there is no one outside who can use it against me. If anyone reads this someday, after I am gone, after the things that have to happen have happened, I want them to know that I was here. I want them to know my name. My name is Vera Whitlock. I am 32 years old. I came to this cabin on the 4th of October in the year of our Lord 1951, because if I had stayed in Harlan one more night, my husband would have killed me, or I would have killed him, and only one of those would have been considered a crime. I closed the notebook. I sat on the bunk with it shut across my knees, and I did not move for a long time. The fire in the barrel stove popped quietly. The wind outside had risen again and was working at the eave above the door. Vera Whitlock, 32 years old, 1951, a woman who had walked into these mountains because the alternative was being killed by her own husband, a woman who had written it down so that someone would know her name. I was sitting in her cabin. I was wearing her stove's warmth. I was reading her hand, and someone was still keeping the chimney patched. I opened the notebook back up and turned to the last written page, not the last page in the book. There were many blank pages at the back, but the last page that had ink on it. The handwriting on the last page was different from the rest. Still careful, still small, but the slant had changed. The hand had gotten older. The grip had loosened. The pencil had been a softer lead smudged a little at the corners. The date at the top was August the 2nd, 1979. I read it without meaning to. My eyes just went. If you are reading this, you have found the cabin. You have found the stove, and I hope you found the birch bark on the grate, and I hope it caught for you on the first match, if it did not try again. Some of it is older than the rest. I am not afraid for you. I do not know who you are, but I am not afraid for you, because if you have made it to this place in this kind of weather, you are already stronger than the world that sent you here. Sit by the fire. Take off your boots. Eat what is in the jars on the shelf. The peaches will still be good. The honey will still be good. The salt pork is in the tin under the bunk. There is more to say. There is more I want you to know, but I will say it slowly and across the pages, so you do not have to take it all at once. What you need to know first is this: you are not the first. You are not the only. This cabin has been waiting for you. It will keep waiting after you for whoever comes next. That is its work. That is mine. If you are afraid, do not be. If you are hungry, eat. If you are cold, build the fire bigger. If you are hurt, lie down on the bunk. The blanket is wool, and it is warmer than it looks. My name is Vera. I am the one who built this place, or rather, I am the one who kept it. The building was done by a man whose name does not matter anymore. The keeping is mine. You will know more soon. For now, sleep. I closed the book. I sat for a very long time on the edge of the bunk with my hands flat on the cover. I do not remember thinking anything in particular. I remember the sound of the fire. I remember the wind. I remember that the apron on the back of the door moved very slightly when a draft from the chinking caught it, and that the movement was so small I might have imagined it, but I did not imagine it because I checked. She had written that in 1979, the last entry, 28 years after she had arrived. She had been 60 years old when she wrote those words, and the chimney patch was new, which meant either she was still alive somewhere and she would now be over 100, which I did not believe, or someone else had taken up the keeping. Someone was still maintaining this cabin, for me, for whoever I was. I stood up. I put the notebook back on the shelf carefully, leather strip still loose on the wood beside it. I did not tie it shut again. Not yet. It did not feel like mine to close. The stove was running steady. The room was warm enough now that my breath was no longer visible. My foot still ached, but it was a clean, alive ache. The cabin had done what it had been set up to do. I needed to sleep. I knew that. I had been awake for 19 hours and walking for 14 of them, and the kind of exhaustion that comes after warmth is the kind that puts you on the floor before you can decide to lie down. But there was one more thing I wanted to look at first. There was a board in the floor near the foot of the bunk that I had registered an hour ago without registering. The grain of it ran differently from the others. The boards in this floor were rough sawn punchin split log, the flat side up, and they all ran north to south, all except one. One board near the foot of the bunk ran east to west. A small board, maybe a foot long, fitted neatly between the others. It did not draw attention to itself, but it was the only board in the room that broke the pattern. I knelt beside it. I worked my fingernails into the seam at the north end. The board moved, not the way a settled floorboard moves, the way a board moves that has been lifted and replaced and lifted and replaced over many years. The fit was perfect. There was a small notch on the underside worn into a finger groove by repeated handling. I lifted the board. Beneath it, set into the joist cavity, was a tin box, maybe 6 inches by 9, black tin with a hinged lid, the kind of box that might once have held tobacco or shotgun shells or letters from a son at war. There were no markings on the outside. I lifted it out and set it on the floor beside me. The lid was not locked. I opened it. There were 3 things inside. The first was a black and white photograph, about the size of a postcard. 2 figures in it. A woman, perhaps 30, dark-haired, standing in front of what looked like this very cabin, holding a small child against her hip. A girl child, maybe a year and a half old. The girl had one small hand wound into the woman's collar and was looking at the camera with the serious, unsmiling face of a child too young to perform for a photograph. The woman was not smiling either, but she was looking down at the child with an expression I had seen on my own mother's face exactly once in a photograph taken the day I was born. I knew without being told that the woman was Vera Whitlock. The back of the photograph had 2 lines written in pencil, the same hand as the notebook. Adelaide, 2 years old, spring 1952. The second thing in the box was a child's bracelet, a small braided cord, frayed and gray with age, threaded through a flat wooden bead. The bead had 2 letters burned into it with what must have been the tip of a heated wire, a period, W period. The letters had blurred at the edges with handling, but they were still legible. AW. The third thing in the box was a piece of newsprint, yellow-brown, brittle at the folds. I lifted it out with the care you give to a thing that has waited. The headline at the top was set in the spare 2-column type of a small county paper, the Harlan Daily Enterprise. The date along the masthead was March the 12th, 1952. The headline read, "Whitlock wife feared lost in mountains. Search suspended." Below it, 4 short paragraphs of text. I read them once. I read them again. A woman by the name of Vera Whitlock, age 32, wife of Mr. Calvin Whitlock of the Harlan community, has been missing since the early part of October last and is presumed by the sheriff's office to have perished in the cold. Her husband, in interview with this paper, expressed his sorrow at the news and his appreciation for the efforts of the search party, which had combed the hollows above Coburn Creek for 3 days in November and again in February to no result. Mrs. Whitlock is survived by her husband and by no children, the couple having had none. Funeral services will not be held. I read the last line 3 times, the couple having had none. I looked back at the photograph in my other hand, at the small girl with one fist wound into her mother's collar, at the words on the back, Adelaide, 2 years old, spring 1952, a child the world had been told did not exist, hidden up in a cabin on Painter Knob with a woman who had been declared dead, a child whose initials were burned into a wooden bead worn smooth by tiny fingers, a W. Adelaide Whitlock. I sat on the cold floor in the firelight with the photograph in one hand and the newspaper in the other, and I tried to make my mind hold them both at once. Vera Whitlock had not died on the mountain in the winter of 1951, she had survived. She had been pregnant when she came up here, or she had given birth here. The man named Calvin Whitlock, down in Harlan, had been told there were no children. Vera had let the world think she was dead. She had hidden a daughter in this cabin. She had raised that daughter, or part of her, in this room with this stove with this apron on the hook. And someone 74 years later was still keeping the chimney patched. I put the photograph back in the tin. I put the bracelet back. I folded the newspaper carefully along its old creases and laid it on top. I closed the lid. I set the tin back into the joist cavity. I lowered the board. I pressed it down with the heel of my hand until it sat flush. Then I stood up, walked to the door, and I looked out through the single foggy window beside it. The snow had stopped. The wind had dropped. The moon was up over the ridge to the east and was throwing pale light down into the hollow. The trees stood still. The hemlock shadows lay long and black across the dooryard, and there in the snow outside the cabin, leading from the tree line to within 10 feet of the door, and then turning away again toward the path I had not taken, were footprints, not mine. I had come up the hollow from the south side. I had stepped only on the path I knew. My boot tracks were a clear single line of compressed snow from the creek crossing to the door, and I could see them in the moonlight clearly. These other prints came from the north, from the higher ground. They came down to within 10 feet of the cabin, made a half circle, as if surveying it, and then turned and went back the way they had come. They were not animal tracks. They were boots, smaller than mine. A woman's boots. The snow had stopped maybe 2 hours before I arrived, which meant these prints had been made after the snow stopped, which meant they were no more than 2 hours old. Someone had been here tonight. Someone had walked down to look at this cabin while I was inside it, freezing my foot and reading a dead woman's notebook, and then that someone had turned and walked back into the trees. I stood at the window for a long time. The cabin was warm at my back. The fire was steady. The apron hung still on its hook. I thought about the chimney patch that was not 75 years old. I thought about the curl of birch bark placed on the clean grate. I thought about the cans on the shelf that whoever had written that last entry in 1979 had said would still be good. You are not the first, the notebook had said. You are not the only. I lowered the curtain back across the window. I crossed the room and added one more piece of split oak to the stove. I sat down on the edge of the bunk and pulled the wool blanket up over my shoulders. I had walked 41 days to disappear from a man who had put his hand around my neck. I had walked into a hollow nobody could find. I had crossed a creek in the dark and lost feeling in my foot and seen a roof line that should not have been there. And I had stumbled into the only room in 1,000 square miles of forest that had been waiting for me by name, not my name, but for someone like me. I was not the first. I was not the only. And somewhere out in the trees above me, in the dark, in boots smaller than mine, someone knew I was here. I did not sleep that first night the way a person sleeps. I closed my eyes the way an animal closes its eyes in a place it does not yet trust, listening down through the floor, listening up through the rafters, listening at the door for the latch. Nothing came. The wind dropped some time before dawn. The fire ate down to a low orange bed of coals. I woke twice to feed it, and the second time I sat on the edge of the bunk in the warm dim and watched the apron move in a draft from the chinking, and I understood that the cabin was breathing. That a cabin a person has lived in for 30 years has a rhythm of air the way a chest has a rhythm, and that whoever had patched the chimney collar had known where the cabin breathed and where it did not, and had left the breathing alone. When the light came, it came gray and thin and slow. I had never seen morning come into a room that small before. It pooled first against the south window in a dull silver smear, then crept down the log wall, finding the kettle hook beside the stove, finding the edge of the shelf, finding the spine of the notebook. Last of all, I got up and stood beside the stove with my hands open to the iron, and I told myself the day's work out loud, the way my grandfather used to do it on the porch with his coffee. Water, wood, roof, door, food, in that order, then everything else after. I put my boots on. The left one had stiffened to the shape of a dead thing overnight. I forced my foot in anyway. I stepped outside. The cold had thinned overnight. The wind was gone. The hollow was full of that particular post-storm quiet that comes when a forest has been beaten and is taking stock. New snow lay over everything to a depth of maybe 4 inches. The hemlocks were bowed under it. The tin roof of the cabin was unevenly white because the heat from inside had melted the snow above the stovepipe in a perfect circle, and I stood in the dooryard and looked up at that circle for a long moment because it occurred to me that anyone on the ridge above could see it too. Smoke in the morning is a flag. A circle of melted tin is a flag. Whoever had walked down to look at the cabin the night before had seen no smoke and no melt because I had only just arrived, and the stove had not yet warmed the roof. This morning she would see both. I do not know why I had decided the watcher in the trees was a she. I had decided it. The boot print I had crouched over the night before had been small and narrow, and the stride between prints had been short. I would have known anyway. She would see the smoke. She would know someone had stayed. The thought did not frighten me the way it should have. The fear from the night before had been worn down by the warmth and by the notebook and by the words a person had written 1979 that said, "You are not the first." The fear had been replaced by a quieter thing, which was the wish to be seen by her on purpose, to stand in the dooryard in daylight, to let her look, to let her decide. I walked across the yard. The boot prints from the night before were softened by the new snow, but not erased. I could still trace them. They came from the upper ridge down through the hemlock break into the small flat behind the woodshed around the south side of the cabin to within 10 feet of the door, and then turned back the way they had come. I followed them only as far as the woodshed. Beyond that, the slope rose into a thicket of mountain laurel, and I did not have the gear or the strength yet to push into laurel. I stopped at the edge of the thicket and stood still for maybe 2 minutes, looking up the slope, holding my breath every few seconds so I could hear past my own pulse. Nothing moved. I walked back to the cabin the way a person walks who knows she is being watched and has decided to let it happen. Slowly, without hurry, I stopped at the woodshed and counted the cords stacked under the eave. 3 full cords of dry oak and hickory split small enough for the barrel stove. I did not split that wood. I could see the age of the splits. Some of them were last year. Some of them might have been 5 years. The newest cord, the one against the back wall, was tight stacked and clean and had been done with an axe whose head was sharp and true within the last few weeks, not by me, not by Vera Whitlock, who, if she had lived, would have been 107 years old, by someone. I carried an armload of oak inside. I closed the door. I dropped the inside latch. I sat down on the chair beside the stove. I opened the notebook. The reading went slower that morning than it had the night before because I was not reading for the story. I was reading for the work. I needed to know where the water came from in the warm months, and where the smokehouse was, and whether the spring froze, and whether there was a root cellar I had not yet found, and whether the chinking patches I had seen near the door were ones Vera had done in 1979 or ones somebody else had done last summer. The water came from a spring 64 feet up the slope to the north. A vinyl line ran from a small holding tank set into the hillside down to a hand pump mounted to the east wall of the cabin, outside which connected by short pipe to the kitchen end of the cabin inside. Vera had built the system the first time in the fall of 1951, and it had failed in February of 1952 because she had run the intake too shallow and the frost had heaved it. She had rebuilt it the following summer, with the intake buried 18 inches down, packed in gravel capped with a flat stone. That had been the version that worked. The line I had now did not work. I had walked past the hand pump the night before in the dark and tried it from habit and gotten nothing. The pipe was somewhere split. I would need to find the split. I would need to fix it. I had brought 31 feet of clear vinyl tubing in the pack from a hardware store in Hazard that had let me work off a meal in exchange for 2 days of unloading trucks and pay me out of the till in tubing and matches and a tin of Vaseline. I had the tubing. I had hose clamps. I had time. The smokehouse was 12 feet behind the cabin to the west. I had seen its low, square roof through the trees that morning. I would inspect it later. It was empty almost certainly, but if it had been kept in good order, I could smoke whatever I might be able to take in the way of small game. And Vera's notebook said there was a deer trail along the bench above the spring that ran year-round. The root cellar I had not yet found was beneath the floor of the lean-to. Vera said so in an entry from May of 1953. I made a note to look for the hatch, the chinking patch near the door. Vera had not made that one. Vera's chinking everywhere else was a darker mud, a mix of clay and dried moss, and she had described in detail how she had gathered the moss in the fall of '51 off the shaded north faces of fallen poplars. The patch by the door was lighter. The patch by the door used a binder I did not recognize. Cement, a small fraction of Portland cement, modern. The patch by the door was perhaps 3 to 5 years old. I closed the notebook. I made a list on the back of a brown paper bag from my pack. Top of the list, water. Second, smokehouse. Third, find the hatch. I did not put the watcher on the list. I did not put her on the list because I did not know yet whether she was a problem to solve or a person to meet. I have learned since that this was the most important kind of patience a person can practice, the patience of not deciding too soon what someone is. I went out to the spring that morning. The slope above the cabin was steeper than I had thought. I made it up the 64 feet in 3 rests, breathing hard, my left foot aching at every plant. The spring was as Vera had described it, a small pool the size of a kitchen sink set into a fold of the slope where the limestone bent outward and the cold water seeped through. The flat stone Vera had placed over the intake in 1953 was still there, half buried in leaf duff. I lifted it. The intake fitting beneath it was rusted to nothing. The original galvanized pipe had failed 20 years ago at least. The split was right there plain, as if she had set it out for me to see. I sat back on my heels by the pool and watched the water move, clean, cold, silent, the kind of water that has been moving through that fold of stone for 10,000 years and does not care who comes and goes. I do not know how long I sat there, long enough for the sun to clear the eastern ridge, long enough for my breath to stop showing. I walked back down to the cabin. I drank a tin cup of water I had melted from snow the night before. I ate 2 saltines. I picked up the splitting axe from the corner of the cabin, the one with the copper wire wrapped around the head, and I walked back outside to start the day's wood. That was when I saw the basket. It was sitting on the step, the flat split log step in front of the door. It had not been there 40 minutes earlier when I had walked out to the spring. It was a small basket, woven of oak splints, lid closed, the handle worn dark from use. I stood very still in the dooryard with the axe in my hand. I scanned the tree line. The hemlocks at the north edge of the clearing were still. The laurel above the woodshed was still. The sun was full now on the upper slope and threw long blue shadows down across the snow, but nothing in those shadows was moving. I crossed to the door. I crouched. I set the axe down beside me carefully and lifted the lid of the basket. Inside was a small cloth-wrapped bundle. Beneath the cloth, when I unwrapped it, was a loaf of dense brown bread, still warm. The crust was firm. There was a smear of butter visible at the cut end. The bread had been cut in half before it was wrapped, perhaps, so the heat would not spoil it under the cloth. Below the bread, in a folded square of wax paper, was a slab of salt pork, maybe a pound, smoked, dark at the edges. Below the salt pork, wrapped in newsprint that was not old, was a tin of evaporated milk and a small glass jar of honey. Below those was a note. It was written on the same kind of brown paper I had used for my list, pencil sharp. The handwriting was not the handwriting from the notebook. The handwriting from the notebook had been Vera's, small and slanted and patient. This handwriting was rounder, older, the hand of a woman who had perhaps once written like Vera, but whose grip had begun to soften with age, the way an older woman's hand softens after 70. The note said only this: "Welcome. I will come down tomorrow at noon. Do not be afraid. My name is Adelaide." I read the note 3 times. Then I sat down on the step beside the basket, in the cold sun, in the open, where anyone watching from the trees could see me, and I let myself laugh once quietly into my own gloved hand, because the world had been trying to kill me for 41 days, and now it had sent me bread. Adelaide. I did not need the photograph from the tin box under the floor to tell me who Adelaide was, but I went inside anyway and lifted the board and took out the photograph and held it, the small girl with one fist wound into her mother's collar, the flat wooden bead on a braided cord, a W. The child in the photograph had been nearly 2 years old in the spring of 1952, which made her 74 years old today. 74, the age of my own grandmother would have been if she had lived, the age at which a woman who had spent her life keeping a cabin in the Cumberlands would still be plenty strong to walk down a slope with a basket of bread and back up again before the woman she was bringing it to had finished her cup of water at the spring. I put the photograph back. I closed the tin. I lowered the board. The bread was for me to eat. I understood that. I ate it slowly, sitting on the chair by the stove, with a smear of the honey on the cut end. I had not had bread in 19 days. The taste of it went through me like a memory of my mother's kitchen. I ate one half of the loaf and saved the other. I drank a cup of water. I put the salt pork in the tin under the bunk where Vera had said in her note that salt pork belonged. Then I picked up the axe again and went out to split wood, because Adelaide was coming tomorrow at noon, and what I had decided in the warm space of the half hour after I read her note was that when she came down the slope and out into the dooryard, the woman she met was going to be a woman who had spent her morning splitting wood, not a girl curled at a stove waiting to be saved. I split wood until my arms shook. The work warmed me through. By mid-afternoon, I had a quarter cord stacked beside the existing pile, and my hands had gone numb in the good way, the working way, the way they go numb when they have done what was asked of them. I worked on the water line in the last hour of daylight. The split in the galvanized pipe was where Vera had said her own first attempt had failed in February of '52. Frost heave. I dug down through the snow and the leaf litter and the frozen crusts until I found the broken end. I cut the bad section out with the small saw from my pack. I fitted a length of the clear vinyl tubing into the good end above and the good end below, using barbed brass fittings from a hose clamp kit I had carried since Hazard. I packed gravel around the joints. I covered it back. I did not open the intake. The grandfather and the granddaughter both knew evidently that you do not open the intake until the line is buried and the trench is tamped. I worked the rest of the line down to the hand pump on the east wall, 28 feet. I found 2 more bad joints. I patched them. I tamped the trench. I went inside and lit the lamp and ate the rest of the bread. When the dark came, I sat on the bunk and read the notebook again. I read forward this time. I read the year 1952. I read about a woman carrying a pregnancy through a winter alone in a cabin on a mountain. I read about a labor that took 31 hours and ended at 5 in the morning of March the 8th, 1952, with a small girl child born onto a folded wool blanket on the puncheon floor. Vera had written that down 4 days afterward in shaking pencil. I named her Adelaide for my mother's mother, who told me when I was 9 years old that no man would ever own me unless I let him. I have just spent 4 days proving her right. I sat with that page for a long time. Then I turned to the next page. The next page was a letter, not an entry. A letter written on the notebook paper, addressed to no one, dated April 4th, 1952. To anyone who finds this, the letter began. I write this because I do not know if I will live through the next winter. I am 33 years old. I have a daughter who is 1 month old. Her father does not know she exists and will never know. He is the man I left in October. I left him because he had beaten me 4 times in 2 years, and the last time he had broken the small bone in my left wrist and told me that if I left him, he would kill me on sight in any county in Kentucky. I did not believe he would kill me. I believed he would do worse than kill me. I believed he would take the child if there was a child. I believed he would take the child and raise her to fear me and to despise me and to repeat what he had done to me, only this time with my own daughter's mouth telling her own daughter someday that this was the way a man was supposed to be. I would rather have been dead in a snowbank with the child dead beside me than have allowed that. I came up here. I had been here before. I had come to this cabin in 1946 with the man who had built it, a man I will not name who is dead now and has been since 48. He had taught me how to keep the stove and how to lay the pipe and how to split wood the way my arms could manage it. He left it to me by a letter at the bank in Lexington that the lawyer found and read out the year he passed. I have a written claim to this cabin and to the 80 acres around it in my own name, lodged in a safe deposit box in Lexington under the name of my mother's sister. No one in Harlan knows it is mine. No one in this county knows. So I am here. I will stay here. I will raise my daughter here for as long as it is safe, and I will move her to my mother's sister's house in Lexington when she is old enough to be hidden in a city instead of a hollow. My sister will raise her under another name. I have already written my sister, and she has already agreed. The letter is sealed in the box at the bank. I have given everything I can give to make sure my daughter outlives me by 60 years. I do not know if I will live through next winter. If I do not, and if a stranger one day finds this notebook on the shelf where I have placed it, I want that stranger to know what was done here and why and by whom. My name is Vera Whitlock. My daughter is Adelaide. We are not lost. We were never lost. We are only hidden. There is a difference. I closed the notebook. I lay down on the bunk in my clothes. I pulled the blanket up to my chin. The lamp burned low. The fire ticked. I closed my eyes and I saw my mother's face. Not the face from the hospital, the face from before, the face that had folded fitted sheets and hummed church hymns and had taught me about frostbite when I was 9, and that the body's own heat was the safest heat there was. I thought about my mother walking out of a house at 17 years old with a duffel bag because her stepfather had begun to come into her room at night. I thought about how she had told me that story exactly once when I was 12, and how she had said, never again would a man put his hands on a girl in my house, and how she had failed at that in the end only because she had run out of years. I thought about Vera Whitlock walking up Coburn Creek Trail in 1951 with a husband behind her who would have killed her on sight. I thought about Adelaide, 2 years old, in a photograph gripping her mother's collar. The small wooden bead burned with her initials on a braided cord at her wrist. I thought about how Adelaide was now 74 years old and had walked down to a cabin last night in the dark to look at it, and how this morning at noon she would come down again and stand in front of me in the dooryard and would be the first person to look at me with kindness in 41 days. I cried a second time. quietly, into the wool of the blanket for maybe 3 minutes. Then I stopped because I did not have the water in me to spare. I slept then. I slept hard. She came at noon. I had been splitting wood again when I heard the snow crunch above me on the slope. I straightened. I set the axe down against the chopping block. I wiped my hands on my pants. I took off my hat. She came down through the hemlock brake the way a person comes down a slope she has walked 10,000 times, slowly, not because her body could not do it faster, but because she had learned long ago that a slope walked slowly does not throw you. She wore a long oilcloth coat, the color of dark moss, a wool cap pulled low, heavy boots worn pale at the toes. She carried a walking stick in her right hand, cut from a single piece of hickory, polished by years of grip, the bottom shod with a brass cap. She came across the yard. She stopped 6 feet from me. I had never seen her face, but I knew it. She had her mother's bones, the same long jaw, the same high forehead. The eyes were a paler blue than I expected, almost gray, and were set in a network of fine creases that came from sun and from cold, and from looking long distances across mountains for a very large fraction of a long life. She looked at me for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You'll be Bryony." It was the first time anyone had said my name out loud in 41 days. I had not told her my name. I had not written it on anything I had brought into the cabin. There was no possible way she could have known. I think my mouth opened. I do not think any sound came out. She watched me work that out. She did not smile. Her face was not unkind. It was simply still. "There's a man at the head of the trail named Otis Penrose," she said. "He's my husband. He owns the gas station in Farwell. You stopped there 4 days ago and bought a Coke and a bag of crackers, and you signed your name on the receipt for a money order he cashed for you for $12 because you'd torn the bill. He noticed you. He said you looked like a girl walking towards something. He sent word up to me at the house yesterday morning. I came down to the cabin last night to look for you. You were already inside, so I went home and baked the bread." She paused. The walking stick was planted in the snow beside her. She rested both hands on the brass cap. "My name is Adelaide Penrose," she said. "I was born in this cabin in March of 1952. My mother was Vera Whitlock. I have been keeping this place since she died in the spring of 1985. You are the 11th young woman to come up that trail in those 41 years. You won't be the last." She watched me for another moment, and then she said very quietly, "Put the axe down properly and come inside. I'll make us some tea." I picked the axe up from where I had leaned it. I set it carefully against the chopping block head, down the way Vera's notebook had instructed in an entry from October of 51. I picked up my hat. I followed Adelaide Penrose into the cabin her mother had built. She did the work I would have expected my own grandmother to do. She moved the kettle from the back of the stove to the front. She opened the firebox without bending and added a single split of oak from the basket beside it. She took 2 tin cups down from the shelf without looking. She produced a small twist of wax paper from her coat pocket and unwrapped it onto the table. Dried mint, crushed fine. The cabin smelled like a summer porch within 30 seconds. She did not sit until the water boiled. When it boiled, she filled both cups and brought them to the chair by the bunk and handed me one and sat herself down on the bunk with her own. I sat on the chair. I held the cup in both hands. I did not drink yet. She looked around the room. Her eyes moved the way the eyes of a person move in a house they have known their entire life, slowly, without searching, naming things to themselves. She said she kept the stove a little farther from the wall than it sits now, 3 inches farther. The brick has slid. I had not noticed. I looked. The brick had slid. There was a clean line in the floorboards where the brick had been for 40 years and now was not. She said, "It doesn't matter. The clearance is still enough." She drank her tea. She said, "I owe you an explanation and you owe me nothing. I'll begin and you can stop me if you'd rather sleep on it first. Some girls would rather sleep on it first. I said, I would not rather sleep on it. It was the first thing I had said since she'd come into the yard. My voice sounded strange in the room, younger than I felt. She nodded once. She set the cup on her knee. She said, my mother wrote down most of what you need to know. You've read some of it. You'll read the rest. What I'm going to tell you is the part she couldn't write down because she didn't live long enough to know how the story turned out. She drew a breath. She said, my mother was a woman who lost everything in 1951 and made herself a new world in the only place no one would look for her. She did it for me. She did it knowing she would probably die doing it. She did not die doing it. She lived. I lived. She raised me in this cabin until I was 6 years old, and then she sent me down to Lexington to her sister, my Aunt May, who raised me as May's daughter under the name Adelaide Penrose, because Penrose was May's husband's name, my father's name, which is to say, the man who would have killed my mother on sight was Calvin Whitlock. He died not long after she left him. The official account was a bar fight in Harlan, a stab wound. The man or woman who put the knife in him was never identified, and the case was never solved. My mother wrote nothing about it in the notebook you have already read. She wrote about it in the other one. I will let you find those words yourself when you are ready. She drank more tea. She said after he died, she could have come down off this mountain. She did not. She stayed. By then, she had begun to understand what the cabin was for. She had begun to take in other women, not many, one every 2 or 3 years, sometimes one a year in the bad years, women who had walked out of houses where they were being killed slowly and who needed somewhere to be for a season. She kept them here. She fed them. She taught them what she had taught herself. Some of them stayed for a winter. Some of them stayed for 2. None of them stayed past the second spring. She said the cabin was a held breath. You took your breath here. Then you went down and you lived. I said, how many? She thought. She said, between my mother and me since 1955, 46 women, counting you. The number went through me the way the cold water had gone through my boot the first night. It was a different cold, but it was the same shape, the shape of something I had not imagined and which the world had not warned me about. I said 46. She said 46 girls and women who walked up this hollow because there was nowhere else to walk to. The youngest was 13. The oldest was 61. Most have been your age, give or take. The cabin sees a particular kind of woman. It always has. I do not pretend to understand why or how, but it has. She set her cup down on the floor beside her boot. She said, I came to this cabin myself in 1973. I was 21. I had married a boy in Lexington when I was 18 who turned out to be exactly the kind of man my mother had warned me about my whole life. I had a daughter from him. I left him the way my mother had left her own husband by coming up here. I stayed with her for 2 winters. I brought the baby. My mother held her granddaughter for the first time on this floor. The baby was named Cordelia. She was 4 months old. She paused. She said Cordelia died in 1998. She was 25. A car accident outside of Cincinnati. She left behind a daughter of her own. The daughter was 8 years old at the time. My granddaughter. Her name was Elspeth. I had set my tea down on the floor at some point. I do not remember doing it. I do remember the next moment with great clarity because it was the moment in which I understood what was happening to me. I said, my mother was named Elspeth. Adelaide Penrose looked at me across the cabin. Her face did not change. The pale gray eyes did not move, but something in the air between us changed. The cabin's quiet rearranged itself around us, the way a room rearranges itself when a person walks into it after years away and the room remembers her and adjusts. She said, I know. She said, I have known since Otis sent word up to me yesterday morning with your name on the receipt from his till. I have known since I looked at the receipt and saw a young woman's signature with the surname Holcomb. Holcomb was my granddaughter's married name, your mother's married name, your father's name before he died of the same drinking that killed half the men in that valley. She said, I came down to the cabin last night because I had to be sure. I looked at you through the south window. You were asleep with the notebook on your chest. I went home and I baked you bread and I came back today. She breathed out very slowly. She said, Bryony, sweetheart, you are my great-granddaughter. I do not remember crying. I remember the cabin going very still and the fire ticking and a soft pressure in my chest that did not have a shape yet. I remember Adelaide setting her cup aside and standing up from the bunk and crossing the 3 steps to where I sat and putting one hand, just one, against the top of my head, not on my face, not on my shoulder, the top of my head, the way you bless something you have been praying about for a long time and have only now been told you are allowed to touch. She held her hand there for a moment. She did not say anything. Then she went back and sat down on the bunk and let me have the rest of the silence. After a long while, she said, Your mother, Elspeth. I lost track of her when she was 12. Cordelia's husband's family did not want me in her life. I tried. I was not always wanted in places I tried to be wanted. I let it go. I should not have let it go. I should have been at your mother's funeral. I should have stood beside you. I did not know she was sick. I did not know she had a daughter. I did not know your name until yesterday afternoon. She looked at the apron on the back of the door. She said, But I knew you were coming. The cabin knew. The cabin always knows. 46 women, Bryony. The cabin always knows. I did not believe her about the cabin knowing. I do not believe it now, but I believed her about the rest. I believed her about my mother. I believed her about Cordelia. I believed her most of all about the bread. We sat there for a while. She let me cry without watching me cry, which was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in a year. She watched the fire instead. After a long while, she said, There is more. There is more you need to know about my mother, about what she actually did, about the man who built this cabin, who was not my father, about why his name does not matter anymore, but my mother's name does, about what she really left buried here and what she meant for us to find. But that part is for another day. You have had enough days today for one day. She stood up. She picked her walking stick up from the corner. She said, I will come down tomorrow. I will bring bacon. I will bring eggs. I will bring the other notebook. I said, The other notebook. She paused with her hand on the door. She said, My mother wrote too. She opened the door. She said, The one you've been reading is the one she wanted strangers to find. The other is the one she wrote for me, and now I suppose for you. She stepped out into the snow. I sat by the stove in the warm cabin with the empty tin cup at my feet, and through the south window I watched her go back up the slope, the way she had come, slowly planting the brass cap of her walking stick in the snow, with each step the long oilcloth coat moving against her legs. She stopped once at the top of the rise. She did not turn. She just stood there for a few seconds looking out over the hollow, the way her mother had no doubt stood there 10,000 times. Then she walked on into the hemlock brake and was gone. I sat for a long time. The fire ate down to coals again. The cabin held its warmth. The apron on the back of the door moved once in a small draft and then was still. I had walked 41 days to disappear from a man who had said my mother's name to me with his hand on my neck. I had stumbled into the only room in 1,000 square miles of forest that had been built by my great-great-grandmother in the year 1951 to save her own life and her daughter's life from a man exactly like him. I had been welcomed in by the daughter of that woman who was 74 years old, who had been baking bread for women like me for 40 years, and who was my own blood. I was not the first. I was not the only. And there was a second notebook. Adelaide came down the next day, a little before noon. She came carrying a canvas sack over one shoulder and her walking stick in the other hand, and her steps down the slope were the same measured steps she had used the day before, the kind of steps a woman uses on a mountain when she has decided that no slope is going to be the one that takes her, not at her age, not at any age. I was on the roof when I saw her. I had climbed up to repack the chimney collar properly. The pine pitch patch I had pressed into the gap that first night had held through the storm, but I wanted to do the job right, with fresh tar from the coffee can on the stove shelf, the way Vera's notebook said. I sat on the ridge with the can wedged between my knees and watched my great-grandmother come down to me through the trees. She raised the walking stick toward me as she crossed the dooryard, not waving exactly, acknowledging. I climbed down the way I had climbed up by the locust pole Vera had wedged against the south wall years ago and never moved. Adelaide set the sack down on the step. Eggs, she said, bacon, coffee, lard, a new pencil, the other notebook. She looked at the chimney patch. You did it right, she said. I followed her instructions. That's what doing it right means. She let me carry the sack inside. She let me put the eggs in the cool corner by the north wall, and the bacon in the tin under the bunk, and the coffee in a jar on the shelf where Vera had kept her own coffee. She watched me do these things without offering to help, and I understood after a minute that she was not watching me to judge me, but watching me because she had watched a great many young women put away groceries in this cabin over the years, and she liked the work of it. It was a thing she had a relationship with. When everything was put away, she sat down on the bunk and lifted a smaller bundle from inside her coat. It was wrapped in a square of green oilcloth and tied with a piece of twine. She did not hand it to me. Before I give you this, she said, I have to tell you what my mother actually did, the part she could not put in the notebook you have already read, the part that is in this one. She set the bundle on her lap. It is not a kind story, she said. I have told it to 4 women before you in this room. 3 of them needed to hear it. 1 of them did not, but she heard it anyway because she had asked. I do not know yet which one you are. I will tell you, and you will decide afterwards which one you were. I sat down on the chair by the stove. The fire was low. I added a piece of split oak. I closed the firebox. Tell me, I said. She drew a breath. My mother came up this hollow in October of 1951, carrying a child she had not yet told anyone about, she said. Not me. That child was me, and I would not be born until March. The child she had not told anyone about was a different child, a little boy. He was 3 years old. His name was Samuel. The fire pulled in the stove. The cabin held. Samuel was the son she had had by my father, Calvin Whitlock, in 1948, Adelaide said. She had not been allowed to keep him at home. He had been a sick child from birth. Calvin's mother had taken him to raise in the next county because Calvin's mother believed my mother was unfit. Unfit because she had once in the first year of the marriage gone to the sheriff in Harlan to file against Calvin for what he had done to her arm. The sheriff had laughed. Calvin's mother had heard about it and had decided that any woman who would shame her family in front of the law was not a woman she would allow to raise her grandson, so she took him. My mother had not seen Samuel since he was 11 months old. Adelaide closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. In September of 1951, she said, Calvin's mother died of a stroke. The boy Samuel was sent back to Calvin's house. 3 weeks later, in the first week of October, the boy was dead. She said it plainly. He was 3 years old, she said. Calvin reported that the boy had fallen down the porch steps. The county coroner in Harlan accepted that account because the county coroner in Harlan accepted whatever account a man like Calvin gave him. My mother went to view the body at the funeral home. She saw the marks on the boy's back and on the backs of his small legs. She knew what those marks were. She had carried marks like that on her own back for 2 years. The room was very quiet. She buried her son on the 3rd of October in the cemetery behind the Methodist Church in Harlan, Adelaide said. She walked out of the cemetery that afternoon. She walked home. She packed a single bag. She went to Elmer Bishop's farm at Farwell, and she asked him to drive her as far as the Ridgeline Road cutoff. She walked up Coburn Creek Trail that night. She arrived at this cabin the next morning, October the 4th, 1951, the first entry in the notebook you have already read. I had stopped breathing without noticing. I made myself breathe. She came up here knowing two things, Adelaide said. She knew she was pregnant again. She had known for 6 weeks. She had not told Calvin. She would never tell Calvin. The second thing she knew was that she was not going to let Calvin Whitlock die a natural death. The fire ticked. In April of 1952, with me 1 month old in this cabin, Adelaide said my mother walked down off this mountain at night. She walked 26 miles to Harlan. She found Calvin Whitlock drinking at a bar called the Blue Heron, which had since closed by the time I was old enough to look for it. She waited for him outside in the alley behind the bar. When he came out, she stepped from behind a stack of barrels and she put my grandfather's hunting knife into his ribs 3 times. She walked back out of the alley. She walked the 26 miles back. She arrived at this cabin a little before dawn on the second day. She fed me. She wrote nothing about it in the notebook. Adelaide paused. I want you to understand, she said. She did not write it down because she did not know whether the notebook would ever be read by anyone other than herself, and she did not want to leave behind on paper a thing that could be used to hang a woman who had a baby to raise. She wrote it down later, in the second notebook, the one I am about to give you, after Calvin had been dead for 30 years, and the case had been closed, and the sheriff in Whitley County who would have cared about it was himself dead of cirrhosis. I sat with my hands on my knees. I did not look at the bundle on Adelaide's lap. I looked at the apron on the back of the door. I said, after a while, she killed him. She killed him, Adelaide said. She killed the man who had killed her son. She killed the man who would have killed her and me and you and your mother and every woman down the line from us if she had not done it. She killed him with her hands. She walked 26 miles each way in April to do it. She was 33 years old. She had a 1-month-old baby. She breathed out. She is the reason you exist, Adelaide said. I want that to be plain. Calvin Whitlock would have found her eventually. He had begun to ask in Lexington after her by way of cousins. There was a Pinkerton man he had hired. She knew about all of it from Elmer Bishop. She knew she had perhaps another 6 months before he came up this hollow. If he had come up this hollow, he would have killed her, and he would have killed me in my crib, because that was the kind of man he was, and the cabin would have ended. There would have been no second notebook. There would have been no 46 women. There would have been no your mother. There would have been no you. She lifted the bundle. My mother did one act of violence in her life, she said. She did it for the reasons a woman does the one act of violence in her life. She did it so that everyone who came after her would not have to. She held the bundle out to me. I took it. It was heavier than I expected. The oilcloth was old, but the twine was new. I untied the twine. I unwrapped the oilcloth. The second notebook was smaller than the first. Hard bound, the same dark brown but slimmer. The corners were worn, but the spine was sound. There was no leather strip around it. There was a small pencil clipped into the spine. I opened it to the first page. The handwriting was Vera's, the same small slanted hand. The pencil was sharp. The date was April the 9th, 1952. I will not read aloud what was written there. Some things a woman writes for one other woman to read, and the chain of women it passes through is not a chain to be broken by a stranger reading the words. I read the page once. I closed the notebook. I held it in both hands. Adelaide watched me. You can keep that, she said. It is yours now. It was mine for 41 years. Before that, it was hers for 33. It is going to be yours. I said, why mine? You have it. You could have kept it. She said, I am 74 years old. I have a husband who is 78. He is well, but he will not always be well. I have no children living. My granddaughter died before I knew her well enough to give her this. My great-granddaughter was unknown to me until 2 days ago. I have been keeping this cabin for 41 years on the chance that someone from my own blood would one day walk up Coburn Creek Trail and need it. That is the chance I took. I am very tired, Bryony. The chance has paid out. You are here. She set her hands on her knees. She said, I have something else to tell you. I have not told it to anyone yet because there has been no one to tell. Otis knows part of it. He does not know all of it. He is a good man, and he does not need to know all of it. She looked at me. In the spring, she said, I am going to sign the cabin and the 80 acres to you. The papers are at a lawyer's office in Lexington in a safe deposit box my mother opened in 1948 under the name of her mother's sister, my Aunt May. I have the key. I have had the key since 1986. The deed is in my name. The lawyer is expecting me to come down in April and to bring with me the name of whoever I have chosen. I had not chosen anyone before yesterday. I have chosen you now. The fire ticked. The cabin is yours, she said, not in a sentimental way, in a legal way, with 80 acres of timber and the spring and the smokehouse and the lean-to and the deer trail along the bench and the right-of-way down to the Ridgeline Road cutoff. You will pay the property tax. It is $28 a year. I will give you the money for the first 10 years out of an account I have kept for that purpose. After that, you will manage. She said this the way a woman says a thing she has rehearsed alone in her own kitchen for many years. I did not answer for a long time. I do not remember what I felt. I remember the cabin. I remember the second notebook in my hand. I remember the apron and the comb and the shelf and the smell of the cedar shavings still faint in the firebox from the night I had arrived. I remember thinking that I had walked north on the 2-lane out of Harlem 43 days ago with $63 and a knife, and that I was now being given 80 acres of Cumberland by a woman who had baked me bread before she knew whether I would eat it. I said finally, I don't know what to say to that. She said, you don't have to say anything to that today. You are going to live here through this winter, and you are going to read the second notebook, one entry at a time, and you are going to think about whether you want this. In April, you will tell me whether you want it. If you do, I will sign it over. If you do not, I will sign it to the next woman who comes up the trail. There will be another. There always is. She picked up her empty cup from beside her boot. She said, but I will tell you what I think. I think you will say yes. I think you will say yes because you have already begun the work. You patched the chimney before you read either notebook. You split a quarter cord of wood on your second day. You fixed the water line on your third. You are the kind of woman this cabin recognizes. I have brought 11 women to this room in 41 years. I have known by the end of the first week which ones were the cabins and which ones were only passing through. You are the cabins. She stood up. I'll come down again in 3 days, she said. I'll bring more eggs. The hens are laying through the cold this year for the first time since I can remember. It's a good sign. She went to the door. She stopped with her hand on the latch. She did not turn around. She said, there is one more thing. I waited. She said, my mother died in this cabin in the spring of 1985. She was 66 years old. She had a heart that had begun to go. I was 33 years old, the same age she had been when she killed my father. I came up to be with her for the last 2 weeks. She died on a Tuesday in early April. The trillium had just come out along the creek. She died in that bunk, where you have been sleeping. She paused. She said, I buried her behind the cabin, on the rise above the smokehouse under the white oak that was already old when she found this place. There is no marker. There has never been one. I did not want there to be a marker because I did not want anyone who came up this hollow looking for her to ever find her. She turned her head slightly, not toward me, toward the door. In the spring, she said, when the ground thaws, I will show you where. You should know. It is yours to know now. She opened the door. She stepped out. She closed it behind her. I sat for a long time on the chair beside the stove with the second notebook in my hands. The light moved across the cabin floor. The fire ate down. I did not get up to feed it. I let it go to coals. I let the cold begin to creep back in along the floor. I sat there until the light at the south window had gone gray, and then blue, and then nearly out, and then I got up, and I fed the stove, and I lit the lamp, and I sat back down. I opened the second notebook to the first page. I read it again slowly. I read the second page. I read the third. I did not read more that night. 3 pages was as much as I could carry. I lay down on the bunk where Vera had died. I pulled the wool blanket up. I closed my eyes. I thought about her. I thought about a 33-year-old woman walking 26 miles in the dark with a hunting knife to do the things she had decided in October would have to be done in April. I thought about her walking, the 26 miles back, the knife clean, her hands clean, the baby waiting. I thought about her never writing it down for 30 years because she had a daughter to raise. I thought about her writing it down at last, in 1982, when she was 63, in a notebook she gave to her own daughter to keep until her own daughter could give it on. I thought about Adelaide Penrose carrying that notebook for 41 years, waiting for someone to give it to. I thought about my mother. I thought about Elspeth Holcomb, hospice nurse folder, of fitted sheets, who had walked out of a house at 17 because her stepfather had come into her room, who had never told me the rest of what she did to survive that, who had told me only never again would a man put his hands on a girl in my house, who had failed at that promise only because she had run out of years. I thought about whether my mother had known, about whether my grandmother Cordelia had known, about whether the second notebook had ever been read by either of them, or whether the line had broken somewhere between Adelaide and Cordelia, and the women in my family closer to me had been left to figure it out on their own without ever knowing that there was a cabin and a notebook and a story. I thought about whether it mattered that they hadn't known. I decided that it did not. The cabin had waited. The cabin had not needed them to know. I slept. The winter went the way Adelaide had said it would. She came down every 3 or 4 days. Sometimes she brought eggs. Sometimes she brought a small joint of meat from her own freezer. Sometimes she brought nothing but herself and sat on the bunk and drank tea with me for an hour and went back up the slope. She never stayed past the middle of the afternoon. She never spent a night. She said her bed was up at the house with Otis and that she was too old to sleep on a thin mattress, on a rope-sprung bunk, and that there was no shame in saying so. I did the work. I finished the water line in the 3rd week of November. The spring ran clean into the cabin through the hand pump on the east wall on the morning of November the 22nd, a Saturday. I primed it twice, and on the second prime, it caught, and the water came in a thin, clean stream that smelled of stone and cold and limestone. I stood at the pump and let it run into the enamel basin until the basin overflowed. I drank from the basin with both hands. The water tasted the way Vera had said it would taste, like cold ground. I split wood through December. By the solstice, I had 2.5 cords stacked against the south wall under the eave. The pile reached the bottom of the south window and stopped the way Vera's notebook said it should stop, so as not to block the morning light. I learned to shoot. Adelaide brought down the .30-30 in the 2nd week of December. It had been Vera's. It had been wrapped in oilcloth in the rafters of Adelaide's own woodshed for 30 years. Adelaide had not fired a rifle in 20 years and would not fire one now, she said, but she would teach me what her mother had taught her. We went out together to a clearing above the spring and she set up 3 tin cans on a fallen log, and she handed me the rifle, and she stood behind me with her hands behind her back, and she watched me hit 1 can in 7 tries, then 5 and 7, then 6 and 7. We did not shoot a deer that winter. There was time. There were more winters. I learned to read sign. Adelaide showed me the deer trail along the bench and how to tell a fresh track from a track that had been frozen and thawed twice, and how a doe walks differently from a buck even when their hooves are the same size. She showed me the place where a bear had scarred a beech tree 6 summers earlier and how to tell that the bear had not come back. She showed me which root was Solomon's seal and which was a plant that would make me sick if I dug it by mistake. I learned the names of things. Adelaide had a way of naming things that made them stay named. The slope above the spring was the bench. The bench above the bench was the upper bench. The cut where the creek bent west was the elbow. The flat where the smokehouse sat was the small flat. The other flat, the one nobody used, was the lower flat. The hemlock that had been struck by lightning the year Adelaide was born was the lightning hemlock and still stood scorched on its north side, still alive, putting out new growth every spring from the south side of its crown. She had named these places when she was a girl, and she had not renamed them since. I read the second notebook. I read it the way Adelaide had given it to me, 1 entry at a time, slowly. I read the entry about Vera's son Samuel, and I lay on the bunk for an hour afterward and did not move. I read the entry about the walk to Harlan and the walk back, and I went outside into the cold and split wood until I could not feel my hands. I read the entry about the years after when Vera had begun to understand that the cabin could be used for more than her own hiding. The first woman who had come up the trail in 1955, a girl of 19 with a broken jaw who had walked in from Whitesburg over the ridge by mistake, having meant to walk to her aunt's house in Bell County and having taken a wrong fork at the Ridgeline Road. Vera had taken her in. The girl had stayed for a winter. She had gone down in April and had moved to Cincinnati and had written 1 letter to Vera in 1963 to say she was alive and married to a good man and that her daughter was named Vera, in honor of a woman the daughter would never meet. Vera had pasted the letter into the second notebook. I read it. The handwriting was the handwriting of a woman who had taught herself to write past a broken jaw, slow and careful. I read about all of them, 46 women going back to 1955, some of them named in full, some of them only by a first initial, some of them with no name at all, only a date of arrival and a date of departure, and a line or two about what they had needed. Some had stayed a winter, some had stayed 2. One had stayed only 9 days, had eaten everything Vera could feed her, had slept 20 hours a day, and had walked down the trail on the 10th day, a different woman from the one who had walked up. Vera had written that the work had not always been long work. Sometimes the work had been very short. Sometimes the cabin had only needed to give a woman a place where nobody could find her for 9 days, and that had been enough. I read the entries about the women Adelaide had taken in after Vera died in 1985. The handwriting changed at that point from Vera's small slant to Adelaide's rounder, older hand. The work continued, the cabin continued. Adelaide had taken in fewer women than her mother. She had not had Vera's gift for being where a woman in trouble would find her. Adelaide had relied on letters from women who had been there before, women who knew of other women who could point a niece or a friend or a daughter up the trail when the time came. The network was small, but it was real. Hazel Krause in Frankfurt, who had been there in 1968. Edna Vale in Madison, Indiana, who had been there in 1977. Marjorie Hatch in Knoxville, who had been there twice, once in 1980 and once again in 1988. Each of them had become in her later years a woman who watched for the next woman in trouble. Each of them had occasionally written to Adelaide and said, "There is a young woman I think the cabin can help." And Adelaide had said yes, send her almost every time. I read the last entry Adelaide had made. It was dated November the 15th, 1998, the day after she had received word of Cordelia's death. The entry was 3 lines. My daughter is dead. I do not know what to do with this notebook. There is no one to give it to. I read those 3 lines once. I closed the notebook. I sat in the chair by the stove for a long time. I thought about how Adelaide had carried that notebook for 28 years after writing those 3 lines, not knowing whether she would ever find someone to give it to. 28 years of keeping the chimney patched and the wood split and the cabin breathing on the chance that a woman of her own blood would walk up Coburn Creek Trail one day in the cold. 28 years of faith in a thing she had no reason to have faith in. I picked up the pencil clipped into the spine. I opened the second notebook to the next blank page after Adelaide's 3 lines from 1998. I dated the top of the page, November the 28th, 2026. I wrote, I am Bryony Holcomb. I am 18 years old. I am the great-granddaughter of Vera Whitlock. I have been at the cabin 23 days. I am going to keep it. I closed the notebook. I put it on the shelf beside the first one where they belonged. January came down hard. The temperature on the small thermometer outside the south window dropped to 9 degrees on the morning of the 4th, to 2 degrees on the morning of the 11th, and to 15 below on the morning of the 18th. The cabin held. The chimney patch held. The water line held. I learned in that 2-week stretch what it meant to live inside a structure that was working at the limit of what it had been built to do and to be the only person responsible for keeping it working. The fire could not be allowed to go out for more than an hour at a stretch day or night. The water line had to be dripped through the coldest nights to keep it from freezing in the buried stretch above the spring. The damper had to be set differently when the wind came from the northwest than when it came from due west, because of the way the cabin sat in the saddle of the hollow and pulled draft from one direction more than the other. I learned these things by failing at them small. The fire went out twice in January. The line froze once, and I lost half a day thawing it with a kettle. The damper got away from me one night, and the cabin filled with smoke, and I had to throw the door open and stand outside in the bitter cold for 10 minutes while the place aired itself out. None of these failures were dangerous. None of them broke anything. They were the small failures a person makes in the first year of living somewhere, the failures that teach you what it costs to live there. Adelaide watched me make them and said nothing about most of them. The smoke incident she heard about because she came down 2 days later and the cabin still smelled faintly of it, and she asked and I told her. She nodded. She said her mother had done the same thing in her first winter. She said the cabin gave a person 3 years of small mistakes before it asked her to learn for good. I had 2 3/4 years left. In February, I shot my first deer, a young doe on the bench trail at first light. She came into the small clearing where Adelaide had told me to set up, and she stood there for the long count of 3 before she decided to take the next step. And in the second of those 3 seconds, I put 1 shot into her behind the shoulder, and she went down without taking the 3rd step. I dressed her there on the snow with the small knife my grandfather had pressed into my palm and the larger gut hook I had bought in Hazard with my last $6. The work took me 4 hours. I had read about it. I had not done it. I made mistakes that would not have been mistakes a second time. When I was done, I dragged the carcass back to the cabin on a small sledge Adelaide had brought down for me in January, and I hung the meat in the smokehouse. And I sat down on the step afterwards with my back against the cabin wall, and I shook for 10 minutes from cold and from exhaustion and from the particular tiredness that comes after a person has taken a life she needed to take and has done it well. Adelaide came down that afternoon. She looked at the deer in the smokehouse. She did not comment on the cuts. She said, "Your mother would be proud of you." I said she didn't know about any of this. Adelaide said she didn't have to know about this to be proud of you. She knew about you. That was enough. That was the only time we spoke about my mother directly in those 4 months. Adelaide did not push. I did not offer. We had time. April came slow. The snow gave way in the 3rd week of March and gave back in the 1st week of April, and then gave way for good. The trillium came out along the creek. The first redbud opened on the slope below the smokehouse on the 8th. Adelaide and I walked up the rise behind the cabin on a Tuesday morning in the middle of April. She took me to a white oak that had been old when Vera had found this place. She showed me where Vera was buried. There was no marker, but Adelaide had set 3 river stones at the head of the grave and a 4th a little to the side, and I understood without being told that the 3 were for Vera and the 1 was for Samuel, who was buried in Harlan, but who had needed a stone here too. Adelaide stood there for a while. She did not pray. She did not speak. She looked at the stones the way a woman looks at a place she has been coming to for 41 years and will not be coming to many more times. Then she said, "Let's go down to Lexington next week. The lawyer is expecting us." We went down to Lexington the following Wednesday. Otis drove. He was a tall, thin man with kind eyes and a careful way of speaking, who treated me with a courtesy I had not had directed at me in many years. He took us to a small law office on a side street near the courthouse. The lawyer was a woman in her 60s named Margaret Brace, who had been the daughter of the lawyer Vera had hired in 1948 and who had taken over her father's practice in the early 80s. She had been holding the cabin papers for Adelaide since 1986. She read the papers to me. She had me sign in 3 places. She had Adelaide sign in 2. She notarized everything. She handed me a manila envelope. The cabin and the 80 acres around it were mine. I was 18 years old. I had walked north out of Harlem 176 days before with $63 and a knife. We drove back up to Painter Knob that afternoon. Adelaide sat in the passenger seat. Otis drove. I sat in the back. None of us spoke for the first hour. The radio was off. The road wound up through Bell County and into Leslie, and the red buds were out everywhere along the cuts. After a while, Adelaide turned her head toward the window and said without looking at either of us, "I thought I was going to die without this getting done." Otis reached across the seat and put his hand on hers. She said, "I am not going to die without it getting done." He said, "No, you are not." That was all the 3 of us said about the day. I lived at the cabin through that spring and into the summer. Adelaide visited twice a week. We worked together on the roof in May. We replaced the tin on the north slope where it had gone too thin to last another winter. Otis came up twice with a load of new tin in the back of his truck and helped us carry it up the trail in pieces. The 3 of us laid the new tin on a Saturday in late May. We finished at 4 in the afternoon. We sat on the step afterwards and drank coffee from a thermos Otis had brought. The cabin behind us was tighter than it had been in 40 years. In June, Adelaide brought down a small wooden box. Inside was a letter from a woman named Hazel Krause in Frankfort, Kentucky, who had been the 7th woman to come up the trail in 1968. Hazel was now 79. She had written to Adelaide twice a year since the year she had left the cabin. The letter said that Hazel's granddaughter, a girl of 22, was in trouble, the kind of trouble Hazel knew the cabin had been built for. Could Adelaide help? Adelaide looked at me. I said, "Bring her up." Adelaide said, "You're sure?" I said, "That's the work." Hazel's granddaughter came up the trail in the 2nd week of July. Her name was Frances. She was 22. She had a black eye that was 4 days old and a wrist that had been set wrong in an emergency room in Lexington 6 months earlier and had healed crooked. She arrived at the cabin a little after 4 in the afternoon. I had baked bread that morning. The bread was still warm. I stood in the dooryard when she came down the slope the way Adelaide had stood in the dooryard for me 8 months before. I had my hands at my sides. I did not have a walking stick yet. I would have one someday. I said, "You'll be Francis." She stopped 6 feet from me. She looked at me. She was 4 years older than I was, and she looked at me the way a woman looks at another woman she is trying to decide whether to trust. I said, "My name is Bryony Holcomb. I was born in Harlem, Kentucky. I came up this trail in November of last year because I had nowhere else to go. I have been at this cabin since. I am going to keep it for as long as I am alive to keep it. You can stay as long as you need to. There is bread inside, and the stove is going, and the bunk is made. Put your pack down and come in." She did not move for a moment. Then she did. She put her pack down on the step. She bent her head. She walked past me into the cabin. I followed her. I closed the door behind us. The fire ticked. The apron hung still on its hook. The 2 notebooks sat on the shelf side by side. Frances stayed at the cabin through the rest of that summer and into the fall and through the following winter and out into the spring after that. She stayed almost the full 2 years Vera had said was the longest a woman should stay. We worked together. We split wood together. We took 2 more deer between us in October. We mended the lean-to in November when a tree limb came down across the corner. We hauled 3 loads of stone up from the creek in the spring to extend the small flat behind the smokehouse because we had begun to talk about planting a kitchen garden, and a kitchen garden needed flat ground and full sun, and we had a corner where it could go if we built a low wall. Frances did not talk much in the first 3 months. She watched. She listened. She slept 14 hours a day for the first 2 weeks, the way a body sleeps when it has been holding itself awake for too long. When she finally began to talk in early October, she told me about the man she had left in Lexington in 3 or 4 pieces over the course of a week, never all at once, never the whole story, until I had a shape of it that I could carry with me. She did not cry when she told me. She had done her crying somewhere else. By the time she came up to me, she was not in the part of grief where a person cries. She was in the part where a person learns to use her hands again. I gave her the 2nd notebook to read in November. She read it the way Adelaide had given it to me, 1 entry at a time over the course of 6 weeks. She read about Vera. She read about Samuel. She read about Calvin Whitlock. She read about the 46 women, and she read about her own grandmother, Hazel, the 7th of those 46. And she sat at the chair by the stove and read her grandmother's letter to Vera from 1963, and then read it twice more, and then closed the notebook and went outside and walked up to the spring and stood there alone for an hour. When she came back, her face had changed. Not entirely. The bruise around her eye had faded by then, but there was still a way she held her shoulders that was the way a woman holds her shoulders when she has not yet remembered how to let them drop. That way of holding her shoulders had begun that morning by the spring to loosen. Frances left the cabin in May of the following year. She went to Cincinnati. She had cousins there. She had a place to land. She wrote me 1 letter in August to say she was working at a library and renting a room above a bakery, and that her wrist had stopped aching at night. She wrote me another in December to say she had met a man at the library who borrowed books about birds and was patient and quiet. She wrote me in the spring after that to say she had moved out of the room above the bakery and into a small apartment with the man, and that she did not know yet whether it would last, but that for the first time in her adult life, she could imagine wanting it to last. She wrote me 1 more letter in the fall of 2030 to say that she had a daughter. The baby was named Vera. There is 1 more thing I want to write down because I do not know if I will live long enough to write it any other way. The cabin was built in the summer of 1946 by a man whose name I never learned and whose name Vera would not write down. He was a friend of her family. He had loved her. She had not loved him in the way he wanted. She had loved him in another way, which is the way a young woman loves a man who teaches her how to split wood and how to lay pipe and how to read a slope, and who does not ask anything of her in return except that she remember the things he taught her. He died in 1948. He left her the cabin and the 80 acres in a letter in a safe deposit box, and he left her one other thing, which was the knowledge that the cabin existed and that no one else in the world knew about it. She used what he had given her. She used it to live and to raise a daughter and to take in 46 women in 33 years and to die in her own bunk at 66, surrounded by the work she had made of her own salvation. Adelaide used what Vera had given her. She used it for 41 more years. I am using what Adelaide has given me. I will use it for as long as I am able. When I am no longer able, I will give it to a woman of my own blood, if I have one, or to a woman of someone else's blood, if I do not. The cabin does not care about blood. It only cares about keeping. I am 26 years old as I write this. It is October the 4th, 2034, 73 years to the day since Vera Whitlock walked up this hollow with her son 3 days in the ground and her second child 6 weeks in her womb and a knife in her bag and a decision already made in her chest about what the next April was going to require of her. Adelaide Penrose has been dead for 7 months. She died at home in Farwell of pneumonia in late February of this year, 2 weeks short of her 82nd birthday. I had been down with her for the last 6 days. I had slept on the floor beside her bed. Otis had been on the other side. The three of us had not said very much. Adelaide had not had the breath for it. What she said near the end on the last full day was that she had been a lucky woman. She had been raised by her mother for the first 6 years of her life and by her Aunt May for the next 12, and both of them had been good to her. She had married a poor man in Lexington who had turned out wrong, but she had survived him, and she had then married Otis Penrose at 26 and had been married to him ever since, and Otis had never raised a hand or a voice or even an eyebrow at her in 56 years of marriage. She said she did not know how that had happened to her. She said she did not know how she had been so lucky. She said she wanted me to know that the world was not always the world that had sent my mother and her mother and Vera up into the hollow. She said the world had Otises in it. She said it was important to know that. I held her hand at the end. She went quietly the way a long candle goes when the wax is gone. Otis sat in his chair and did not weep until she had been gone for 10 minutes, and then he wept once briefly, and then he stopped, and he stood up, and he walked to the kitchen, and he made the three of us coffee, except that there were only 2 of us now, and he set hers down on the table anyway. He said it was a habit. He said he would stop doing it eventually. He said he was not in a hurry to stop. Otis lived 3 months past her. He died in May of the same year. He had a stroke at the gas station mid-morning with 2 regulars in the shop, and he was gone before the ambulance reached the head of the road. The regulars told me he had been laughing at something one of them had said. I chose to believe them, and I still do. I buried both of them in the cemetery in Farwell because they had wanted that, and not on the rise behind the cabin because they had not. Adelaide had been clear in the last days that the rise was Vera's and Samuel's, and that she did not want a third stone there. She wanted to be in Farwell with Otis, where people could come and see them if they wanted to come and see them, which Adelaide thought no one would, but she wanted the option to be open. She had said near the end that she did not want anyone climbing a mountain to mourn her. She wanted to be reachable. I keep the cabin alone now. Frances is in Cincinnati. She has the child. She writes twice a year. 3 other women have come up the trail since she left. One was a girl of 17 from outside of Pikeville who stayed for 2 winters and went down in the spring of last year and is now in Knoxville training as a vet tech. One was a woman of 44 from Asheville who stayed for a winter and went home to her sister's house and has not written, but the woman who sent her up has written and the woman is alive, and that is enough. The third was a girl of 20 named Sally, who came up last September and is here with me now, asleep on the bunk as I write this by lamplight. She came up with a broken collarbone that had been set right, but with bruises along her arms that had been set by no one because no one had known to look. She is 6 weeks at the cabin. She is starting to talk. She has not asked me yet about the second notebook. I will let her ask. I have been thinking lately about the birch bark. Vera laid a curl of birch bark on the grate of the barrel stove the last day she ever stood in this cabin in the spring of 1985, knowing she would not come back. She did it for the next woman. She did it because birch bark catches from a single match, even when it has been dry for a decade, and because she had decided that whoever came after her deserved fire within 60 seconds of needing it. I lay a fresh curl of birch bark on the grate every time I close the cabin for any reason, even when I am only going down to Farwell for the day, even when I am only walking up to the spring. I have done it so many times now that I do it without thinking, the way Vera must have done it without thinking by the end. I think sometimes about the men in this story, about Calvin Whitlock, whose name I will not write a second time, about Roy Tillman, who is still living in the house on Crawford Street in Harlem as far as I know, and whom I have not seen in 7 years and do not intend to, about the unnamed man who built this cabin in 1946 and loved Vera and was loved by her in a way that did not ask, and who left her this place by a letter in a safe deposit box because he understood before either of them understood it what she might one day need it for, about Otis Penrose, who was a good man and who knew he was married to a woman who had been keeping a secret cabin in the woods for 41 years and who never asked her to stop, and who drove me to Lexington on the day my name was put on the deed, and who said when I tried once to thank him that there was nothing to thank him for, because his wife was his wife and her work was her work, and a man's job was to make breakfast on the days a woman was tired. I think about how the work of saving women has been in this story almost entirely the work of women. I think about how the small acts of good men inside that work, Elmer Bishop driving Vera as far as the Ridgeline Road, cut off in 1951 without asking her where she was going, the unnamed builder leaving the cabin in his will, Otis Penrose carrying a load of tin up a trail at 78 years old, the manager of the hardware store in Hazard feeding me grits at 5 in the morning and not calling the sheriff have been what made the larger work of women possible. I do not think a person needs to choose between those two things. I think a person can hold them both. I think a person should. I think about my grandfather who pressed the buck knife into my palm the summer before he died, and who told me about the Cumberlands, where a person could disappear. I do not know whether my grandfather knew about the cabin. He was Cordelia's husband's father. He came into the line by marriage. There is no way for me to know what he knew, but he told me about disappearing, and he gave me the knife. And when I came up the hollow in November with that knife in my pack, I had the strong feeling, which I cannot prove, but which I will not stop having, that he had been pointing me in this direction without entirely knowing he was doing it. The line of women had a man in it after all, several men when I look, not the men anyone would have noticed at the time, but the right men in the right places doing small things that turned out to be larger than they looked. I think about my mother more than I write down. Elspeth, 36 years old, hospice nurse, the woman who folded fitted sheets without anyone teaching her, and who hummed church hymns when she did not believe the words. I do not know whether my mother would have known what to do with the second notebook if she had been given it. I do not know whether she would have read it. I do not know whether she would have come up the trail to meet Adelaide Penrose, who was her own grandmother, and whom she did not know. I do not know what she would have made of any of this. She had her own life. She had a daughter to raise and a job to do, and a body that had begun to betray her, sooner than she had any reason to expect. She did not have time for the line of women. The line of women has time for her posthumously. That will have to be enough. I think about my mother's last week often, although I do not write about it. I sat with her at the hospice, the same hospice she had worked at for 12 years until she became a patient there instead of a nurse, and I held her hand the way a daughter holds the hand of a dying mother, which is the only way a person knows to hold a hand without ever being taught how. She knew me until the second to last day. On the second to last day, she stopped recognizing my face, but kept recognizing my voice. On the last day, she did not recognize my voice either. She died at 4 in the morning. I was alone in the room with her. There were no last words. There had not been last words for some time. The last thing she had said to me 3 days earlier, when she had still been able to say things, had been, "Be careful of him." She had meant Roy. I had said I would be. I had not been careful enough. He had put his hand on my neck 23 days later. If she had lived another month, I would not have left. If she had lived another year, I would not have ended up in this cabin. The cabin would have waited for some other woman. The line of women would have continued without me. I do not say that to claim I belong here. I say it because it is true. The cabin's accounting is not a moral accounting. It is just an accounting. Some women come, some don't. The ones who come are not better than the ones who don't. They have simply come. I have one daughter born in 2031 by a man named Tobias Penrose. Tobias is Otis's nephew. He drove up to the cabin the spring after Adelaide gave me the deed because Otis had asked him to bring me a load of cedar shingles for the roof, and we had spent 2 days putting them on together. He is older than me. He is quiet. He has a steady job at a sawmill in Pikeville. He does not live at the cabin. He lives in town, and he comes up on weekends, and our daughter splits her time between the cabin and his small house in Pikeville, depending on the weather and the season. Her name is Lily. She is 3 years old. She has Vera's long jaw and her great-great-grandmother May's pale eyes, and she is the gentlest child I have ever known. When she is old enough, I will give her the second notebook. Or I will not, and she will find it on her own when I'm gone, and she will read it then, and she will decide what to do with it. I have promised her nothing. I have promised the cabin nothing. I have promised myself only that the chimney will be patched, and the wood will be split, and the birch bark will be laid on the grate every time I close the door behind me. The other day before she went down to sleep, Sally asked me a question. She had been at the cabin almost 6 weeks by then. She had not asked it before. She asked, sitting on the bunk with her knees up and her arms around her shins, why I had not left, why I had not gone down to Lexington or Knoxville or Cincinnati or any of the places the women before me had gone down to when they had finished their time, why I had stayed. I thought about it for a while. The fire ticked. The apron moved very slightly in a draft from the chinking, the way it has moved for 80 years and will keep moving as long as I am alive to feed the stove. I said after a while, because somebody had to. Sally said, but you could have given it to someone else. I said, I could have. She said, why didn't you? I said, because I read the second notebook when I was 18 years old, and a woman who had been carrying it for 41 years gave it to me, and I understood that day what it had cost her to carry it, and I decided I would not put it down until it had cost me what it had cost her. I decided that 26 was too early to put it down. I decided that 36 was probably too early. I decided that whenever the day came that I put it down, it would not be because I had grown tired of it. It would be because the next woman had walked up the trail. Sally did not say anything for a while. Then she said, am I that woman? I said, I don't know yet. You might be. There's no hurry to find out. The cabin tells you eventually. You'll know when you know. She nodded. She lay down on the bunk. She pulled the wool blanket up to her chin. She was asleep within 5 minutes. That is what this mountain taught me. That is what the women before me taught me. that is what I will leave when I go. If something in this story landed for you, if you know what it means to fix a thing with your hands, or to read another woman's handwriting and feel her standing behind you in the room, or to walk 41 days in winter because there was nowhere else to walk to, and find, at the end of the walking a fire that someone laid for you long before you were born, leave it in the comments below. I would like to know your version of it. Tell me your name. Tell me the name of the woman who taught you. Tell me who you will teach. The cabin is still here. The bread is still warm.